Welcome back to the Country House podcast. We're recording this on 4th of July. It's election day. Have you both voted today, Rory and Geoff?
Not yet, but I will.
Not, not yet, but I will as well.
I went first thing in the morning. It was freezing, but that'll be interesting. But by the time this is released, that will all be a bygone memory. But today, sticking with that kind of general election political theme, we're discussing Chequers. Chequers, the country house for sitting prime ministers, the country escape. Rory, what is Chequers besides that? How did it come to be what we know it to be?
Thank you, Ben. It's funny enough. It's quite a long story. There's the Chequers has a rather sort of interesting early history. So the first thing to say about Chequers is that although we all know about it because of its relationship with the prime ministers from the 20th century onwards, it has a very ancient history. So it sits at the foot of the Chiltern Hills, 40 miles from London, and it sort of grew out of Ellsborough Manor in the 12th century, or we think it did. We're not really sure. And we think that the name Chequers can derive from two possible sources. So it's either this early owner in the 12th century called, and I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, so I do apologise, Elias Ostiarius de Scacario, there we are, who, there's an excellent pronunciation there, who was an usher to the court exchequer, and Scacario means chessboard in Italian, and his coat of arms included a checkerboard or a chessboard as part of his role in this capacity. So we think that that's sort of possibly one option for where Chequers came from in terms of the name, which is highly appropriate because he's politically involved, and the chessboard symbolises sort of politics and kind of not intrigue exactly, but machinations and things like that, which of course Chequers is now very much at the heart of. Or more simply, that there were lots of Chequers trees, which is a very ancient kind of tree in England, in the grounds, and that's where it gained its name from. So we don't really know, but it kind of adds to the mystique. But in any case, it's very old.
I think it's interesting, Rory, jumping in. There's a handful of houses in Britain which are so well known, they don't need to have a park or a place or a court or a hall after them. So you think of Chatsworth, for example, just being a single word, or Petworth or Blenheim. Yes, they are, is Chatsworth House or Blenheim Palace, but, in the same way with Chequers, it's such an identifiable, iconic house that it doesn't need sort of anything after it, does it?
Yes, it doesn't need a sort of architectural prefix, does it? No, I absolutely, you're completely right. It is very interesting. Because one of the reasons we talk about this, dear listeners, is because I was panicking before the podcast trying to work out what the correct name of a house was. It's slightly embarrassing to get it wrong, but it transpires that there isn't really one. So anyway, so that's the kind of the early history really of Chequers. And then it passed through the the Dawtrey family, which was anglicised into Hawtrey, and the Hawtrey family essentially built the house as we see it today. It was rebuilt in 1565 in the middle of Queen Elizabeth I's reign into the kind of classic Tudor house that I'll go on to talk about in a moment. And it's sort of under the Hawtreys, it had an interesting time because it ended up becoming the jail of Lady Mary Grey, who was the sister of Lady Jane Grey, who is famous in England for having been queen for about a week or something like that, because she tried to take the throne after the death of Henry VIII's son, and then got ousted by Queen Mary. So this is all just before Elizabeth I becomes queen. And so the Greys were not a terribly lucky family, it's safe to say. And it was poor younger sister called Mary Grey, basically married without Queen Elizabeth I's permission. And Elizabeth I got extremely pissed off about this, and basically sent Mary Grey into sort of, what's the word? What would you call it? Sort of, well, she was imprisoned in a country house, basically, under the haw trees at Chequers. And there is to this day a prison room where she was incarcerated for about 2 years. So that's a pretty interesting bit of history. And then after that, the house has sort of quite a complicated history, because for some reason the owners never, I mean, they didn't seem to have sons, and so it kept passing to their daughters, and then obviously the daughters' names were changing the whole time. So it passed through the Wooleys, the Crookses, the Thurbanes. In 1715, one of these daughters married the grandson of Oliver Cromwell, the great parliamentarian leader in the Civil War. And so the house gained a lot of Cromwell memorabilia, which we'll talk about later. Again, highly appropriate for its function today. And then finally, in the 19th century, the owner, Henry Rhodes, Henry Rhodes was employed to alter the house into the Gothic style. The next owner then rapidly backtracked and ungothicized it and turned it back into the Tudor building we see today. So at which point its sort of modern iteration takes place as the country house for the Prime Minister. So it's an interesting place. In terms of the pure architecture, it's relatively easy to describe. It is basically a kind of cardboard cutout, chocolate box, Tudor country house. It's sort of built in an E shape to symbolise the E of Elizabeth I's name. It has lovely mullioned windows, gables, tall brick chimneys. The whole thing is in brick, very quintessential Elizabethan building material. It's sort of semi-symmetrical, semi-proportional. It's not classical yet, but it's not medieval either. It's got a sort of formal geometric garden in front of it. So, it very much is a classic Tudor manor house, really. Inside, although it's been messed around quite a lot, it basically maintains the atmosphere of a quintessential Tudor house. It's got a kind of great hall with tiers of paintings hanging in it. It's got what looks like a minstrel's gallery. It's got heavy Tudor paneling, geometric plasterwork in the ceilings, which again is very quintessential Elizabethan interior design, and a long gallery, which is now a library. So it's basically, old stock of England, perfect example of a kind of indigenous country house. And that's where I will wrap up. And
well, Rory, I was going to say it had a brief phase when it wasn't as Elizabethan as it is now. Isn't that right?
Well, yes, it was Gothicized in the 19th century, briefly, and it had sort of battlements. Where are my notes? What did I say? It had battlements and turrets. And then clearly the next owner decided that this was a terrible decision and architecturally backtracked and took them all down again. So yes, it has cosmetically it has changed a bit. But I mean that's just sort of classic sort of stylistic shift which we see in so many country houses around the UK. I suppose what's interesting is that it was reversed, wasn't it? Because that's less usual. It's more usually a composite sort of exercise.
And interestingly, it was reversed and restored by Sir Reginald Bloomfield, the Victorian architect, who was known for building, the great sort of Victorian churches and townhouses. So it's interesting that he built the Menin Gate, for example, in Ypres in Belgium. So he was very sort of Victorian Edwardian in his style, yet he was able to restore Chequers to sort of its authentic Elizabethan sort of history, which I think is interesting.
But that's not surprising in a way, because at that time in the late sort of 19th century, early 20th century, the Edwardians were absolutely obsessed with the arts and crafts movement, which, whilst it was a sort of mishmash of lots of different styles, it was partly medieval, but it was also loved Tudor architecture, Elizabethan architecture, Renaissance English architecture, and so although one is a little surprised to learn that Blomfield worked on it. I suppose it does make sense that he was so interested by it.
Yeah, and I think it's probably helpful then that sort of segues nicely into sort of where we are today with Chequers, because the last, again, through the female line, it passed from the Russells to the Astleys, and it was the Astleys who were the last sort of ancestral family to own Chequers, and they were the family that restored Chequers with Blomfield to its Elizabethan origins, and they did that in the late 19th century. I think between 1892 and 1901, it was restored. And only sort of 7 years later, they decided to lease the house out. And this is where our politics comes in, because the person who took the lease in 1909 was Sir Arthur Lee and his wife Ruth. Sir Arthur Lee was later raised to the peerage as the first Viscount Lee of Fareham, and his American wife Ruth, with whose money they leased and eventually bought the freehold of Chequers. So it's really interesting thinking, for example, of Winfield last week that we did, where it was American money that bought a London townhouse, or Blenheim, which we talked about, where American money rescued it. In this case, it was American money that that purchased Chequers, and ultimately it was that same family, the Lees, who gave the house to the nation. So we have much to thank American money for. In this country, particularly in the country house world. So Arthur Lee was an interesting man. He was a real sort of he made a really impressive career for himself, but he didn't come from a particularly grand home. I think his dad was a vicar in Dorset, and his grandfather was a midshipman at the Battle of the Nile. Which is quite interesting. But he went out to Canada at the age of 24 to become a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston, Ontario. And whilst he was there, he later worked as a diplomat, but whilst he was there, he met Ruth Moore, whose father was New York banker John Moore, who was one of the great bankers of the sort of gilded period in American history, working alongside the likes of the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan and others. And she inherited this fortune from him. And what was interesting is when Lee and his wife returned to England in 1900, he embarked on this political career. So he was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament, and he was then an MP for the next sort of 20 years until he was elevated to the peerage. But he wanted a country seat because he didn't come from a country seat. And so in 1909, they bought the lease of Chequers from the Astley family and immediately started work continuing with the renovations. So they commissioned Henry Tipping, the famous arts and crafts garden designer, to redesign the wall gardens between 1911 and 1912. And then in 1912, when the last of the house's ancestral owners died, Ruth Lee, Arthur's wife, who had the money, purchased the property and gave it to her husband. So she purchased the freehold. So that's sort of how it came into the political sphere, and they would have entertained and hosted all sorts of politicos and MPs and government ministers and diplomats, because he himself had been a diplomat, and they didn't own it for long actually before they decided to give it to the nation. So they owned it. Basically, it was requisitioned during the First World War, became a convalescent home for officers, and after the war, having had long discussions with David Lloyd George, the then Prime Minister, the Lees decided to give Chequers to the nation, and they did it through an Act of Parliament, the Chequers Estate Act of 1917. And I've got to I'll pass on to Ben in a minute to talk a little bit more about subsequent usage of the house, but I've got to just mention this extraordinary clause in the Chequers Estate Act. It's quite long, but it's such a beautifully written clause, and it essentially contains Arthur Lee's reasoning and his thoughts for why he gave Chequers to the nation. So he wrote this: It is not possible to foresee or foretell from what classes or conditions of life the future wield as a power in this country will be drawn. Some may be, as in the past, men of wealth and famous descent. Some may belong to the world of trade and business. Others may spring from the ranks of the manual toilers. To none of these, in the midst of their strenuous and responsible labours, could the spirit and anodyne of Chequers do anything but good. In the city-bred man especially, the periodic contact with the most typical rural life would create and preserve a just sense of proportion between the claims of town and country. To the revolutionary statesman, the antiquity and calm tenacity of Chequers and its annals might suggest some saving virtues in the continuity of English history and exercise a check upon too hasty upheavals, whilst even the most reactionary could scarcely be insensible to the spirit of human freedom which permeates the countryside of Hampton, Burke and Milton. Apart from these more subtle influences, the better the health of our rulers, the more sanely will they rule, and the inducement to spend 2 days a week in the high and pure air of the Chiltern Hills and Woods will, it is hoped, benefit the nation as well as its chosen leaders. The main features of this scheme are therefore designed not merely to make Chequers available as the official country residence of the Prime Minister of the day, but to tempt him to visit it regularly and make it possible for him to live there, even though his income be limited to his salary. I love that. It's so beautiful, and it's, he was quite a visionary in foreseeing the fact that the era of the great landowners being wielders of power was coming to an end. You think about past prime ministers, a lot of them were peers in the House of Lords as opposed to MPs, the likes of Lord Liverpool or the Duke of Wellington, but actually, and they all had their grand country seats, but actually he was recognising that era was coming to an end.
Well, we are literally about to see that now, aren't we? I mean, the current Prime Minister today has, as we all know, lots and lots of money. Rishi Sunak could probably afford more than one Chequers if he so wished. And we're probably about to get a Prime Minister who couldn't. So this is the Chequers Act in action.
And actually, that to be fair, both the outgoing Prime Minister and the probable incoming Prime Minister both don't come from, Rishi Sunak was the son of a pharmacist or a doctor, and if Keir Starmer wins the election, he's the son of, as we heard recently, the son of a toolmaker.
Is he really, Geoff? I've never heard.
As he said in his Question Time special recently, and got quite a lot of chat for it.
Now we need a candlestick maker, and then we'll have a full trio.
So Ben, tell us now, since the Chequers Estate Act was passed and the House given to the nation, tell us how it's been used, and some of the great stories of some of the prime ministers who have lived there.
Gosh, there are so many. I don't even know where to start. But perhaps following on with a few other quotes from Arthur Lee, one of which is embedded into a stained glass window in the house. This house of peace and ancient memories was given to England as a thank offering for her deliverance at the Great War 1914-18, and as a place of rest and recreation for her prime ministers forever. Now, less formal than that, he said, the better the health of our rulers, the more sanely will they rule. And, maybe we need to bring back the mandatory 2-day-a-week stay if more sanity will prevail coming from that. I think we could all deal with that. But no, it's very easy to sway off into those things. But no doubt the political significance of this house and the usage of it has changed. And probably most prominent that change occurred in modern times under Tony Blair, when he requested special permission from the trustees to use it for work. And since then, an invitation to Chequers is a very powerful weapon in the arsenal of a prime minister. To bring a foreign power over to Chequers is a significant invitation. And we've seen it time and time again where big visitors have come. So that evolution has changed things significantly. And
but
even from then,
Ben, I'm intrigued that it happened on Tony Blair, because I know that Benazir Bhutto visited Mrs. Thatcher in the 80s.
Well, Thatcher hosted much, Gorbachev as well. But these were very informal visits. So you didn't have what you saw with Theresa May, for example, the famous press conference with Trump in the garden with press. It was strictly off limits for quote unquote work, official business going on. With Trump and recently with Zelensky, and kind of using it as a political pawn, because you even saw the famous, well, maybe not very famous looking back at it, the Chequers Act with Theresa May, where she brought all of the cabinet to Chequers, kind of like when you see them deciding a new pope in the Catholic Church and they all stay in the Vatican until it's decided. We have all the ministers coming to get a plan for Brexit, which obviously...
Well, that'll stay up there in the great pantheon of British political cock-ups, won't it? I mean, that was just another absolutely top-notch, dog's dinner, really.
But going along with that evolution, again, under Blair in 2007, the Chequers estate was designated as a protected site under the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act of 2005, which specifically criminalised trespass. So there is, under Blair, you do get this kind of formalising of Chequers, and perhaps very strategic.
It was the Chequers plan, wasn't it, that Theresa May drew up with on the Brexit deal in I think it was 2018.
Yeah, they all got locked. It was a complete disaster. They all got basically locked in the house, as far as I can remember, until they weren't allowed to leave until they'd essentially agreed to a plan. And basically, everyone just started leaking about everyone else, and the whole thing dissolved into a complete. It was an absolute disaster.
Yeah. Well, it was doomed to fail from the beginning. Not to get too political on this, but the EU had already said that we will not accept those terms, and then they re-brought the terms in that deal, and it was refused, and that led to that was quite significant in a way that led to Boris Johnson gaining incredible influence in the Conservative Party, because that was the matter that caused him to resign from that government, as well as David Davis, and then the rest is history.
And of course, Boris then used the house as the venue for his wedding, didn't he?
Well, Boris, there are a lot of stories of Chequers naturally with Boris.
Well, let's just whoa. Before we get on to that whole kettle of worms, or whatever it's called, can of worms. It's interesting that Theresa May, as you were saying, the house has a certain prestige, a certain weight to it. Being there, being invited there, means something, and so. Yes, the fact that Theresa May felt that she would be able to solve this intractable problem by adding a little magic of Chequers to it tells a lot. That's very interesting. But just before we go on, sorry, I think we should, for our listeners, perhaps speculate as to what prime ministers and state dignitaries, etc., actually get up to there. Because. Thus far, I don't think we've really delved into that. Do we have any idea of how they actually spend their time?
Well, I know. I think it depends. Obviously, it depends on the prime minister. Some prime ministers rarely use the house. Some prime ministers used it a lot. So, for example, I know that Theresa May preferred to go home to her country house near Henley-on-Thames rather than to Chequers, and she rarely used Chequers. Whereas Mrs. Thatcher loved it, and she used it a lot for the soft power stuff. So it might not have been formal state visits, but she entertained, as Ben mentioned, Gorbachev, and as I mentioned, Benazir Bhutto. There's a wonderful photograph of Mrs. Thatcher and Benazir Bhutto in the Rose Garden, for example. And they would have informal dinners. I mean, the collection is extraordinary in Chequers, because the Lees pretty much bought it with the family collection that was there already, and then added to it. So Arthur Lee was a great patron of the arts. He actually co-founded the Courtauld Institute of Art, which is sort of the leading art university in London. He co-founded the Courtauld with Samuel Courtauld and Joseph Devine, and he really filled Chequers. He loved collecting paintings of influential people throughout British history. So, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of Cromwellian portraits because of the family history of the previous owners links to the Cromwells and artifacts. I think I read a story that when solicitors were doing an inventory of the house, they discovered Cromwell's death mask in a cupboard.
Terrifying.
Quite fun. I know it must have been.
It's almost as though Chequers was destined to be the country house of the Prime Minister, isn't it? What with all these references and intrigues and sort of this intimate relationship with, in many ways, not quite the father, but certainly one of the founding figures in our parliamentary democracy. It's jolly interesting.
Which is interesting considering it's quite a modest country house as well. It's not overly grand as well.
Well, it's a very English house. So I think that's why it suits the Prime Minister. You know, Rory talked about how it was Elizabethan, sort of Tudor, late Tudor, early Elizabethan in its architectural style, and that is perhaps the last sort of pure English vernacular, because since it was after that we saw, you know, the emergence of English Baroque and Palladian and you know, Georgian architecture that drew much more on classical influences and Roman and Italian influences. And actually, Chequers is the right house for the Prime Minister because it's, dare I say it, almost, you know, it's purely English. I mean, despite being of the same era as Hardwick Hall, for example, it's not got those Renaissance influences, except in, I think there's a balustrading above the entrance, which has Latin in the balustrading, which is quite Roman. But apart from that, I mean, the collection is quite extraordinary. They've got paintings by the likes of Rembrandt, Constable, Reynolds, Van Dyck, amongst others. So really, I mean, the paintings are extraordinary, and you know, they cover everyone from family portraits, Oliver Cromwell, Mary Grey. I mean, it's a bit cheeky that they have Mary Grey's portrait hanging in the house when she was kept a prisoner there. But
that's iconic. That's properly iconic. If I get held in a house arrest somewhere, I want my portrait on the wall.
Mugshot.
And they also have the Diary of Admiral Lord Nelson, which is held in the house. So
that must be pretty salacious reading. I mean, bloody hell, he got up to no good, Lord Nelson.
It's interesting when I was doing some reading on the collection. The most comprehensive list I could find of artifacts in the house were published by the Daily Express, which for our readers is not the most highbrow publication in the UK. And I loved how they put a bullet point that simply said, "There is a beautiful grand piano that Winston Churchill loved to listen to." It sort of sounds like, you know, they could have described it. They could have said it's, you know, it's a lovely Steinway or a Bechstein or a, you know, Broadwood, but no, a beautiful grand piano that Winston Churchill loved to listen to. I mean, it sounds like exactly the sort of thing the Daily Express would write. But it is interesting that, you know, the house, obviously some prime ministers did fill it with music and laughter and children, you know. So I know, for example, an MP who brought his young brood of children to meet Boris Johnson at Chequers, and they had a family cricket match on the front lawn, and I believe one of the sons, who was sort of, I think, 11 or 12 at the time, bowled Boris out on the first bowl, which Boris wasn't particularly impressed about. So there are lots of fun stories about how the house was used. And of course, they built a swimming pool was built at some point in the last century in the Orangery. And yeah, I mean, it's clearly some prime ministers really did use it as their family home.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the swimming pool, I remember reading Carol Thatcher's writing about her family's stays there, because, of course, as you said, it was very important to the Thatchers. And Carol was very much looking forward to having this private pool because she knew she wouldn't be interrupted by her mother because she was too protective of her hairdo. And then her mother found that it cost the taxpayer £5,000 to run it every week or something silly like that. So she wouldn't let it be turned on. She drained it all and covered it up. But one of my favorite stories, just I was reminded of it from your talking of the collection, Geoff, is that Winston Churchill obviously frequented there, and there was a painting by Rubens with a mouse that just used to catch his eye every time he visited. So one weekend he brought his painting brushes, being a keen artist, to improve the depiction of the mouse on this oil painting by Rubens hanging on the wood-panelled walls. I thought that was a brilliant story of his interaction with this famed collection.
It's classic Churchill doing what he wants to do and not following the rules, which helped us win victory in the Second World War, I suppose, but, you know, put a lot of noses out of joint at the same time.
Well, before we get too patriotic, let's just take a chill pill. I'm interested about. I mean, we've spoken about Boris Johnson and Churchill, and famous conservative leaders. Although mentioning Johnson and Churchill, never mind. The point is that it's not just the country has to right wing prime ministers. It's also the country has to left wing prime ministers. I mean, do we have any idea how the more socialist prime ministers of the 20th century reacted to it? Because in many ways, Chequers symbolised what a lot of them were fighting against. So that surely must have been an interesting relationship.
Well, Ben's already mentioned how Tony Blair corporatized this a little bit by, passing this law so that he could host official functions there, as opposed to just using it as a house. And I suppose that was possibly his own little statement against the fact that he didn't, against the establishment, and pointing out that he didn't need it just to be his own retreat. I don't know, Ben, how did sort of Clement Attlee use it in the 50s? Do you know?
I don't, to be honest, except for the fact that this was back in the 50s. Again, we talk about the evolution. It was really it was used as a family house for these people. What I do know, though, is that many of the staff were previously high-ranking in the military. And we have a quote from Wing Commander Vera Thomas, who was the caretaker there for many, many years, around the 70s and the 60s, so close to that. And her instructions to staff were very simple. She had a line that she was famous for: if the Prime Minister wants mousse on toast at midnight, they get it. So they're incredibly well looked after. And there was sort of this military-esque sense of duty to, again, the better the health of our rulers, the more sanely they will they rule. So I don't have specific stories from, say, Clement Attlee, but it sounds like it was almost, you need to go here and you need to rest up and we'll take care of you because we want you to serve the country well. However, the cost, I remember under Blair and previous prime ministers, the cost to the taxpayer of running Chequers was about 600 grand a year. And it was Boris who employed more staff and took the cost up to 916,000 a year, shelved by the taxpayer.
It's probably worth saying, though, with that, Ben, that of course that includes the state visits and entertaining foreign dignitaries. So, if you think about what I know for a fact that if Boris stayed there without having guests, he had to pay for his breakfast every morning. So, Geoff. Well, no, it's just worth saying that actually, what is that? Am I incorrect? Was that only just to run the state?
We have documented complaints of Boris Johnson saying, because he had to foot the bill for food, drink, and entertaining, that if he ever did want to host there, he would either have to persuade a committee to have the government foot the bill, or he would have to do it. So we have documented complaints of him complaining that whenever he had to host, he would have to put a lot of money up. So I just on that point, I wonder. I wonder if Tony Blair's corporatization of Chequers was perhaps one of the reasons why we kind of see it less and less as a family home, because of the kind of the expectation to use it as a place to host.
That's really interesting, Ben. And I was going to say, it does seem a shame because it goes against Arthur Lee's original reason for doing it. His reason for doing it was that prime ministers would be attracted to go there and rest up, and so they governed better. And if they're put off going because of the costs, because now everything's bureaucratized, it makes it harder for them to, I don't know, it's just an interesting thought, but it would be lovely to see. I mean, we talked in last week's episode about Winfield House being a prime example of soft power, where American ambassadors can host diplomats and politicians and wow them with the interiors and the architecture and the gardens at Winfield, and thus impress upon them some sort of basically help to enamor them to each other. And actually, we know that the Royal Yacht Britannia, for example, was a very good example of soft power as sort of a floating diplomatic mission. And it was a great privilege when it sailed into harbours around the world for foreign heads of state to be entertained on the Royal Yacht. And in the same way, Chequers ought to be a place, I think, where where we can use that soft power. And I think, I mean, I don't know. I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued what Rory's thoughts as a more open-minded or liberal-leaning. This could be the rest of his politics with our different views. In fact, I think we'd be much better than Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, because I think I'm more right-wing than Rory Stewart, and you're probably more left-wing than Alistair Campbell, Rory. So.
I'm not. Hang on a second. Whoa! This is terrible libel. I'm not sure any of. Don't listen to any of that. Don't listen to Geoff, guys. Listen to me. I think it's very interesting. I mean, I wonder if the idea of Chequers. I wonder if it's a better idea on paper than it is in reality. I wonder if it's actually quite hard as a sitting prime minister to go and relax there, because you know that you've only got it because you're prime minister, and you would associate it with the job. And if you've got kids, do you really want them to form an attachment to a house that you could lose at any second? I don't know. I mean, I just wonder. I mean, I'm sure it's very luxurious. It'd be like going to stay at a 5-star hotel or something like that. But I'm not necessarily sure you can turn a 5-star hotel into a family home. I think they're sort of slightly different things.
That's true. And it's interesting thinking about that. I know Mrs. Thatcher loved to host her big family Christmas parties at Chequers. And of course, she was forced to step down as Prime Minister shortly before Christmas one year, and she had to find emergency plans because, of course, as soon as she stepped down from number 10, she lost that as her country residence. So you're right about the transient nature of it, a bit like we talked about that with Winfield last week. Each ambassador put their stamp on it, but they did it, they almost treasured it more, knowing that it was for a limited time only. And I wonder if that's...
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? There no doubt, funnily enough, would have been cars that have driven directly from Winfield to Chequers. So we're doing a bit of a sort of it's an interesting theme to be pursuing on the podcast. I don't know. I mean, I've never been to Chequers. I'd absolutely love to see it. It's incredibly private. As we were all commenting before the podcast, it's hard to learn about it, actually.
It is private, except you can see it from there's a pub because it's at the foot of the Chiltern Hills. There's a hill on what was the estate. The estate's still substantial, but a large part of the estate was given to the National Trust by the government in the 1920s. And that includes Coombe Hill, which has an extraordinary monument on the top, which is a very popular sort of photo opportunity. It's a monument built to commemorate the Second Boer War. And from that monument, you get a lovely view across from the Chiltern Hills, across Buckinghamshire, and you can see Chequers in the valley. So too far away for sort of snipers and security issues, but it's close enough that you can get a lovely view of Chequers from the monument.
Or you can do as one chap did at the very end of June, I think exactly a week ago today, which is you can drunk drive and crash into the gates of there and be arrested. He got a good view. Imagine you choose to drink drive and what am I saying? You choose to drink and drive, and the house that you crash into is the Prime Minister's country house, and you're arrested and
that sounds like the Country House podcast road trip right there. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's Chequers is fascinating because basically it's what they've tried to do is to dissociate in a funny old way. Same with Winfield, although Winfield's a bit different because it's not in the heart of the countryside. But they've tried to disassociate a country house from its family, and they've tried to show the merits of country house living to people who don't necessarily come from that background or that world, who couldn't necessarily afford it. And when it was handed over to the nation, it was considered to be of genuine benefit to the incumbent prime minister. So it's an interesting advertisement, isn't it? I mean, for a podcast where we spend so much time talking about families and continuity, Chequers is defined by a lack of continuity and yet of great value to the state.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Rory. And I think this is, for me, in my research, the most interesting thing is the balance of displaying power in the country house, using it as an example of British power bringing people there who are powerful, versus the personal attachment and the genuine kind of feeling of peace and, gazing out pontifically over the bucolic surroundings and being healed by that in the onslaught. And you have these great stories of Bill Clinton coming to visit, Angela Merkel coming and loving it and trying to get repeat invites. And we have this crazy story of President Xi Jinping of China in the local pub and there's this crazy image of him sat with David Cameron having a drink, and there's just all these local villagers behind them. It's like, is that Xi Jinping in our local? But he loved the beer so much that he actually tried to buy the pub, but they wouldn't let him. But you have these incredible stories balanced with the quite sad nature and, I guess, philosophical link of the country house with the family and your attachment to the land and the house. They had the centenary dinner, 100 years of prime ministers being invited to Chequers, and they invited all the past prime ministers who were still alive. Gordon Brown, John Major, whose wife wrote a book about Chequers. She loved it so much. All of them, and the only people who accepted the invite were Boris and Theresa. And in a way that kind of made me feel sad, because it kind of shows the change from being that genuine offering of healing to a prime minister and the benefits of the country house in a philosophical way to that kind of more political view. And I would finish this ramble that I'm on with some quotes. Dennis Thatcher said, "Chequers is why you get the job." And Margaret said, "I do not think that anyone has stayed long at Chequers without falling in love with it." And the guest who was there on their last day at Chequers, with the obviously very quick finding out that they couldn't be there anymore, sent this quote to Carol, which said, "Dennis and Margaret were walking hand in hand in tears along the gallery that overlooked the Great Hall." And it paints a picture to me similar to Winfield of the prime ministers who did use it, and seems kind of tough to, as you say, get that balance of, I want to get attached to this country house, I want to have my family have happy days here, but it's difficult.
Lady Mary Grey had a laugh.
I don't
She's still laughing from the long gallery.
She's still laughing from it. Yeah, I wonder. She gets to be there permanently, even though she was. No, I wonder. Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way, I mean, as we've established on this, or as we're discussing on this episode, the kind of family home nature of Chequers is questionable, and sort of depends, I suppose, how long you're in power for as a prime minister. But certainly, Chequers very much is what the rest of the world thinks the UK is like, and so to that extent, it's a very powerful.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful thing for prime ministers to use, I think.
It's interesting. Growing up abroad, I always, you're right, and actually, Number 10 Downing Street is how you imagine London to be, with its Georgian terraces and surrounded by history near the Palace of Westminster. And so it's funny. You're right. Both Number 10 and Chequers embody what we imagine of town life and country life, or what people abroad imagine town life and country life for Brits to be like. I must admit, I'm absolutely mortified that I spent several hours researching Chequers today, and I totally forgot that in the bookcase above my bed, I have Norma Major's book on Chequers. And only after Ben mentioned it, I realised I actually bought it at the second-hand bookshop at Kenwood House, which for our listeners, they'll have seen some of our reels and posts on Instagram. We visited Chequers. We did a country house podcast outing. Sorry, not to Chequers, to Kenwood. We did a country house outing to Kenwood earlier this week, and I actually found this in the bookshop there a few years ago, and I'm so embarrassed that I have been trawling the internet and reading essays on Chequers, and I have a book by Norma Major on it right here.
Just quickly scan through and see if we've missed anything.
If we missed anything, I ought to. I think it's interesting what Rory said about how there is less documented. Some prime ministers, there's very little documented evidence of how they used and what they use Chequers for. And I wonder if that's partly because it is the private sanctuary away from work. Of course, I might also say that perhaps the reason why we have more about Conservatives' time there than perhaps Labour prime ministers, because Conservatives have probably have made history more than the Socialists.
Here we go.
No, I'm not going to goad anyone. Don't worry.
Sorry, I think my Wi-Fi just cut out. What did you just say, Geoff? I didn't hear that.
Gosh, anyway, it is an extraordinary house, and it's probably worth saying as well. It's very near London. It's Buckinghamshire is one of the home counties. It's less than an hour by train. I'm changing the subject, Rory.
So if
less than an hour by train from London. If any of our
listeners fancy going on a road trip, getting drunk and crashing into the gates, it's one of the more convenient houses to do so from London.
It's actually very near Wadston, which we covered in a recent episode. The Rothschilds' houses sort of surround Chequers like a sort of guard of honour. And
you don't have to be inebriated to visit those.
You don't. And I might also just say very little access has been given to Chequers with regards sort of journalists and others, but Country Life magazine, after a long sort of wrangling process, managed to do a 2-part article on the history of Chequers that was published about 5 years ago, which is well worth reading because it is more comprehensive in terms of its sort of description of the history and the architecture of the house, and it talks a lot more about the Gothicization and then de-Gothicization of the house. That was written by John Goodall, the architectural editor of Country Life, and it is worth looking at. And in that article, you can also see wonderful recent photographs of the interiors and the house.
We should try and get a Country House podcast exclusive in it. We can try and do a vlog or something for our...
Well, we're likely to have a Labour Prime Minister tomorrow, so I'll leave that to Rory to tap up his contacts.
Gosh. Well, on that bombshell, I think we'll round up this episode. And yeah, it's a fascinating one, not much documented, and with the way things have been going in the last few decades, it is a surprise to me that not even a section of it is sort of open for tours or the public. And who knows, maybe that's something that we'll see happen in the next 5 years. Who knows? Yeah. But thank you all for joining us today to discuss Chequers, and do leave us a review if you enjoyed it. Please don't use it as a platform to express your love for Labour or hatred for Conservatives, or the other way around, by giving us a 1-star based on one of our hosts' political views. Focus on the topic and give us a 5-star review, if you will.
In the words of the rest of politics, we have mastered the art of disagreeing agreeably.
And we will find you and we will kill you. So,
and with that, see you next week. Goodbye.